I bet you've got a dream fly fishing trip in mind. Maybe it's to Alaska or a tour of the American West or all the way down to New Zealand. I also bet that unless you're rich enough to afford eggs, you probably are wondering if you'll ever get to take that trip. I've been in those exact shoes before. The desire to go and fish some incredible place full of gorgeous fish feels like it pulls on every ounce of your attention. You find yourself daydreaming about this trip, wondering which organs you can sell to pull it off, or which rivers you want to fish, or when you need to go fish them. Here's the thing. With the right planning and a little bit of saving on your part, you can have that dream fly fishing trip and keep all your kidneys. I managed a half dozen trips to Alaska when I was either in college or teaching high school English, so this is extremely doable. I'll explain how to pull it off on today's episode of Untangled. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. So I thought I would start off today's show with some stock tips, since everybody knows you've got to be rich if you want to afford one of these great fishing trips. So we're going to be cross-referencing the last 10 years of S&P 500 data with some of Warren Buffett's most recent quotes to see if we can divine where to put our money for the maximum return. Oh, kidding aside, putting together a dream fishing trip, it really is relatively easy, and it does not need to cost an arm and a leg. And I know that we worry sometimes about how much this stuff costs, but you really can pull this off for a relatively, in my mind, reasonable amount. And yeah, we'd all love to go spend a week at one of those fly-in lodges with a 5-star chef and a shower every night, and maybe even your own room if you're really spring for it like that. But that's the stuff that's really spendy. That's like, you got to sell a kid to afford that spendy. So if that's your dream and you really want that experience, you want the lodge and the food and everything, then that's awesome. Keep saving your money and eventually you'll get there. But if you just want to go and have some great fishing and you're willing to compromise on some of the peripherals like food and lodging, then you really can pull this off without spending an unreasonable amount. And the process I'm going to lay out for you here today, it's the same process that I used to plan a half dozen trips to Alaska when I was either in college or teaching high school English, which are two stages of life not known for their financial success. So if I could pull them off at that point, and if I can pull them off at that point buying as many fly rods as I own, then I think this is stuff that a more disciplined or reasonable individual can probably put together without too much trouble. And the principles that we're going to talk about today, these are the same. This is the same principles, the same steps that I would follow if I was planning a trip to the state next door to mine. If I wanted to go explore Idaho or Montana a little bit more, I would do this same stuff. If you're on the East Coast, you want to come out and fish the West, you can use this framework. If you are in the West, you want to go explore what they've got in Pennsylvania or upstate New York, you can use this framework. It's going to work for you. It does not have to always be to some far-flung location. And speaking of locations, that is step one. First thing that you've got to do is figure out exactly where it is that you're going to go. When I go on my Alaska trips, I don't just say, hop on a plane and go to Alaska, right? I've got an actual destination in mind. This last year, my best friend Lander and I, we wanted to go fish for some salmon, and my wife loves salmon, so she wanted me to bring some home. And we also wanted an opportunity to go after some trout, some char, and then some grayling. So we knew that for the salmon, we'd really want to spend the majority of our time down on the Kenai River, and then we could get into some trout and some other stuff on the Russian River. Now, Lander lives in Alaska, so he's got some local knowledge on out-of-the-way spots, and that helped out a ton. But we also just bought this old book. It's a fishing guide to the roadside fisheries in Alaska. I don't know if it's in print anymore, but we got a copy of it years ago, I think right when he first moved up there. And we spent some time reading the book and researching for some other opportunities as well. In fact, there was one point we stopped at this river that was supposed to have trout in it. We got really excited. It's dumping rain, and we're ready to go catch some big fish. And we get to this little river, and it's just full of pink salmon. There were no trout anywhere, and the pinks were fun, but we were chasing like 25-inch rainbow trout. We didn't want to catch pink salmon. So we left. We go to a different river. We hiked forever through the woods to get to this river, and we caught some amazing rainbows in a different river. We actually did a video about that trip. I'll throw that link in the show notes for anyone who wants to watch it. But having those locations defined helped us go have that experience with, oh, this first rainbow trout river didn't work out. Well, great. We have a backup. We know another spot we can go to. And then we went and we were able to salvage it in case there was bad weather or the fish just weren't there. So if you're, let's say maybe you're going to Montana, you want to fish Southwest Montana and you really want to fish the Big Hole. It's an amazing river. If you've never fished the Big Hole, I would probably recommend doing it at least once. It's an incredible fishery. But if you're worried that, the Big Hole might not work, well, there's also the Jefferson and the Ruby and the Beaverhead nearby. You can go fish those as well if the Big Hole's is not fishing well. It pays to have some backup options as well. And speaking of destinations, a place to go, if you're really, you want to go somewhere, but you're not sure. I mean, Montana, Idaho, and Colorado are really big destinations for trout. Oregon and Washington, you go out there for your steelhead. There's trout fishing out there as well. California, you've got salmon, steelhead, and trout you can go play with. And then Alaska, of course. You can go down to Florida for tarpon and bonefish, and then you can go fish the Gulf out of Louisiana and Texas for redfish and some other saltwater species. Belize and the Bahamas are fantastic saltwater destinations too. You've got all of Canada. If you want to go after lake trout and brook trout and grayling and pike, there's a lot of opportunities up there. So there's no shortage of places to go and places to explore if you're really looking for some kind of bucket list type trip. And personally for me, the only real big trips that I'm trying to figure out how to make them happen is I want to go up really far north, like above the Arctic Circle, for Arctic char. They're these beautiful, vibrant fish. They look amazing. I've had a couple of friends who've gone and done it, and they said it was incredible. I want to go experience that. I really want to experience that wilderness that far north too. I think that'd be fun. I've been to the Arctic Circle, but I haven't ever been too far above it. So I really want to get up there and see what that's like. And then I also want to go out to Mongolia to catch taimen, the biggest of all the trout species. It's giant. And I've got a friend who caught, how big was his? I think it was, I'm going to shortchange him. I think it was at least 30 pounds he caught it a couple of years ago. But that's a spendy trip. There is no DIY option for taimen in Mongolia, unfortunately. But anyways, figure out where you're going to go. Then you can move on to step 2, which is you've got to look at your lodging. Now, Airbnb is typically going to be the best bang for your buck if you've got the cash for it. I know there's the cleaning fees and whatnot, but it's nice to have a house and a little bit of room to spread out. If you're willing to camp in a seedy motel, then go for it. You can save money. But sometimes the Airbnbs, I will say, Alex loves them. In fact, he was the first, I think I stayed at my first Airbnb on a ventures trip with Alex. But sometimes they're kind of awful. Give you an example. It was that trip, that first one with me and Alex and his brother Berkeley. We were up filming, and we get up to the Airbnb. And first off, the directions were terrible. It took us forever to find it. Then we couldn't find the key to let us in because it was an actual physical key. It wasn't a keypad. And then we open the place, we go in, and it's got this spooky vibe to it. The lighting was all low, and there were shadows everywhere. You felt like something could jump out and scare you at any moment. And we'll start looking in all the rooms, figuring out who wants to sleep where. And I look in one of the bathrooms, and the bath mat was still wet on the floor, and there was hair on the soap in the shower. So that was terrifying. And then there was a locked door going down to the basement with a sign on it that said, "Do not enter." Looked really scary. And then out back, there's just an axe stuck in a tree stump. What else? Oh, the dishes hadn't been done, so there was still food on the forks and stuff. There was freezer burned ice cream in the freezer just sitting there, not even in a package. It was really sketchy. And Alex is looking at me. He's like, I promise not all Airbnbs are like this one, but it was one of the sketchiest places I've ever been. So not every Airbnb is going to do you well, but most of the time they will. If you're going to go to your destination during a warmer part of the year, then check out some of the campgrounds in the area that you could reserve ahead of time. If paying to camp puts a bad taste in your mouth like it does for me, I mean, I'm not going to pay I think it's like $17 a night in some of these places, even more some places. I'm not going to pay that to camp. Are you kidding me? And anyways, then you can look for nearby BLM or Forest Service land where you can camp for free. The national forests will be marked on Google Maps. And then if you want to find BLM land for camping, if there's not a forest near where you're going to fish, then you can just Google BLM land in this state and you'll get a ton of results for that. And you can figure out where you can camp for that. If you're going to be there for a while, you can always go to a shower at a truck stop, which I know that's scary. But if you need a shower, it's an option. I've done that a couple of times. It's not the end of the world. All right. On my most recent Alaska trip, Lander and I, we got really lucky on this trip because we stayed in 3 and 4-star hotels every night for like $50 a night because Lander knows a guy who got us rooms on the cheap. So we just went ahead and took advantage of that. It was actually, I think it might've spoiled me a little bit. I don't know if I can go back to camping in Alaska. Cause the year before we fished our way along the Denali Highway for part of our trip and we just pulled off the road to camp. Lander slept in the truck. I pitched the tent. It was a great way to spend a few days, but it rained. And the thing about Alaska is everything's wet. Even if it's not raining, you've got the not the permafrost, the permafrost is melting a little bit. And there's just so much water in the air because everything's melting in the summer that everything's just always wet. And that's the one downside to camping in Alaska is it's hard to keep anything dry. But anyways, it's not the end of the world to do that. I've spent plenty of time camping. I recommend that in a lot of ways. So that's your step 2. Step 3, you got to pick your time to go. So if you want to get into the best fishing, there's probably going to be a window of time that you should be in a certain area. So if you want to hit the salmon fly hatch in Montana, for example, then you probably want to be there in late May to early June. If you just want to fish the Big Blackfoot near Missoula, that's the river you want to go get to, then I would call the fly shops and get some advice on when the best time to be there would be. They'll give you all sorts of information, and there's tons of information about this online as well. Especially a lot of these places that people go to all the time. There's a lot of resources to help plan this. For my Alaska trip, we just went ahead and planned to be there at when the peak of the run should be. It's kind of hard to predict year to year, but we were on the tail end of the run and we still caught plenty of fish, filled the freezer. It worked out great, for Lander and I. So there's enough resources online. You don't always need to call a fly shop. It'll help, but there should be plenty of resources to figure out the exact time you should be there. Now, step 4, you got to look at your travel costs. You got to set a budget here. Because at this point, you know when and where you're going, so you got to figure out how you're going to get there. If it's more than 12 hours away from me, I usually fly these days. It's worth it to me at that point, save so much time. And the way that I afford my flights to Alaska or wherever I'm going is I've got a rewards credit card that I use to pay for everything except my mortgage. And if you're listening to this, Dave Ramsey, I'm sorry. I do use a credit card, but I don't carry a balance. I pay it off every month. I'm responsible with my money, okay? And I'm not giving out advice. I'm not telling you to go get a rewards credit card. I think we'd get in trouble if it comes across like that. So I'm not giving advice. But I use all my miles to cover my airfare costs. I've got enough. I could fly to Alaska 2 or 3 times in coach, of course, and not have to pay for it. And then the earlier you buy your plane tickets, the better. Obviously, you'll get a better price on them. And then if you're driving, just make sure you factor in gas prices. as well. And then if you're flying with all of your gear, I did an entire podcast about this a while ago. I'll have to find it and link that in the show notes. But I always take my fly rods on the plane with me. I never put those in checked baggage. I just don't trust them in there. And same goes for my reels. There are a lot of packs you can buy online. Orvis has some, Riversmith has some, Sims has some, Fish Pond I think has some. You'll find plenty of packs, and they're built to store rods and reels in them, and they're built to fit as a carry-on for most airlines. But I've used a few different rod carry options and reel carry options on Delta, American Southwest, Alaska, and I think United too. I might have flown on all of those with fly fishing stuff. I've never had any issues with my rods and reels on my carry-on. I know Alex, when he went to Slovenia last summer, he flew everything. Didn't have an issue getting over there either. You can carry your flies on if you want to, but I put all my flies, waders, boots, and all my outerwear in checked baggage, because if that stuff gets lost or just doesn't show up on time, yeah, that's a pain, but you can usually rent that stuff. You can buy the flies if you need to. But I like my rods and reels. I want to fish with that stuff. I like to have that with me. So that's how I haul my stuff if I'm flying. So there's step 4. Step 5 is start tying some flies or saving to buy them if you're going to be out there. If you tie flies, start tying for the trip as soon as you can. When you call fly shops to talk about the best time to fish, a lot of times they'll give you some fly information, or you can just ask them, what should I tie? If you don't tie your flies, then I'd say set aside probably $150 if you're going to be there for more than a few days, just to cover the cost of flies. Because I think I'm paying about $350 a fly in fly shops these days. That seems to be the going rate. So it adds up pretty quick, especially if you need a lot of one pattern, or there's a specialty pattern that's working that only the fly shop has. But you can also save some money. You can buy one of our fly collections that we sell here. It'll give you a good baseline of flies, a foundation for anywhere that there's trout to work. Then you can just focus on spending your money at the fly shop on maybe some specialty patterns. Like if you're out on the Frying Pan River in Colorado, for example, the mysis shrimp is a big one out there. And I don't think we have the mysis shrimp in any of our collections. So that'd be an example of one. You could go get that, but then one of our collections would still serve you well. I'll throw a link to those in the show notes as well. Step 6, this is my favorite of all the steps because it's the one with food in it. I love food, as you can tell from my rotund figure. I really like having someone else cook for me because I do almost all the cooking right now at my house. My wife's pregnant and she's not feeling so great, so I do all of the cooking here. So I usually budget going out to eat a few times on these trips because I like to not have to cook. But if not, if you're going to be out in the bush and it's not feasible to go get dinner every night or whatever, then just plan to go shopping whenever you get there to buy food. It's just easier. I've found it easier than trying to buy everything at your place and haul it with you. You can do a lot of good cooking with just a couple frying pans and a little Coleman stove. That's all Alex and I usually ever take when we're out and about. And he's really good about prepping food before we go. He'll grill up a bunch of chicken beforehand. He'll buy some salsa. He'll buy tortillas. And then we'll have a few nights of quesadillas or tacos or whatever we're feeling. You can grab a bag of instant potatoes and do steak and potatoes pretty simply. Beef stew is really great. I mean, everything tastes better over a campfire anyways. Doesn't really matter what you're eating. Just keep things simple. That's my best advice. On my last Alaska trip, Lander and I, we spent, I think, like $200 at Costco. And we had enough food to last us like 2 weeks. And our trip was only 8 days. So we bought way more than we needed. And then we ended up eating out quite a few times on the trip anyways. But if we'd only gone out once or twice, we probably could have done the whole 8 days for like $300. So it really isn't too expensive as long as you're not wanting caviar or whatever at night, I guess. So step 7, make sure you don't forget to budget in your licenses, because non-resident licenses cost a lot of money, relatively speaking. In most Western states, you're going to pay over $100 if you want to be there for more than about 4 or 5 days. That's usually the cutoff when you've just got to buy the annual, and that costs you about $100. In Alaska, if I'm fishing anywhere with king salmon and I'm chasing king salmon, I think the license and the king salmon stamp together ends up running me like $150. And then halibut charters, usually your halibut license is built into the cost of the charter, but you'll want to check that if you go out for that as well. One little story Alex wanted to share about his Slovenia trip. He had to go to a specific location in town in Slovenia. He had to pay in cash, and then he had to pay for either a week or a day. Those were his only options, and he wasn't expecting it. He didn't do a whole lot of research into that part of it beforehand, I don't think, but it was worth it for him. So he was able to do that, and not, it didn't derail his trip, but it did surprise him a little bit. And then step 8, you got to start saving. This is I want to say the simplest. It kind of is. But you just add up all the costs you've talked about, and then boom, you get to your budget. You can start saving the cash you need for it. Now, just to give you an example, my last Alaska trip ran me for almost a week of fishing, my half the gas, my licenses, my share of the food, the flies, and all the other tackle I needed, my share of the hotels, processing and shipping the salmon back home. It was just over $2,000 because it did get a little spendy to get the salmon back home. I spent a lot more on that trip than usual because we ate out so much and we stayed in those hotels every night. My usual Alaska trip, if I'm not sending any fish home, it runs closer to about $1,500 because, again, I'm not paying for the airfare. I use my miles for that, and everything else you can do relatively cheap. My last fishing trip that wasn't a ventures trip to Idaho and Montana a few years ago with a buddy of mine, Ryan McCullough, and we were gone for a week, and I think I spent like $800. We camped the whole time. We ate out once, simple meals around the fire. It was a longer drive, so it cost a little bit to get there. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, we bought 2 different licenses because we were in Idaho and Montana. We bought some flies. I probably could have done that trip even cheaper if I'd prepped for it a little bit better. But the point of this is it's very doable to do this on a budget and have a great trip on a budget. I've enjoyed every one of my Alaska trips. Yeah, they haven't been the fly out lodges. I haven't been in the float planes, and I haven't caught the giant rainbows yet. I haven't been to Bristol Bay, but I've had really awesome days out there. Lander and I got into grayling a couple of years ago that were enormous, that were over 20 inches. And for grayling, that's huge. And it was just this little spot right off the road that we found. And there's so many instances like that where you can put this great kind of trip together. And even though it is nice to stay in those fancy hotels and eat the good food, I almost prefer the rugged trips at times because you get to experience just a little bit more of the wilderness. And that's a little bit of why we get into fly fishing in the first place, I think. So I hope that answered some questions and lays out how to plan and execute one of these fishing trips for yourself. If you've got any more questions about anything I talked about, feel free to leave a comment and get in touch. I'm happy to clarify. But with that, folks, we're going to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we spend half the show directly answering questions from viewers and listeners just like yourself. So if you've got a question that you would like answered about fly fishing, go ahead and send that in. There is a link to do that in the show notes. And often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the opener of the show. We get a lot of questions about planning trips, so hence why I did that to open the show. Now, our first question this week comes to us from Jordan from Pennsylvania, writes in and says, "Hello, Spencer. I have been fly fishing for a few months, and I cannot say enough how much the Masterclass series has helped me through the learning process. Now I listen to the podcast every day when driving to work or driving to go fly fishing. I have 2 questions for you. The fish in the river I fish are notorious for only biting small flies, typically size 20 or even smaller. When casting my rig, I have difficulty seeing the top fly because of how small it is. Is it appropriate to cast 2 flies, such as a larger fly in combination with a smaller fly, so that I can see when they hit that smaller fly? To piggyback off that, could I use an indicator instead of a larger fly? My second question is, when I am mending, my fly line tends to sink a few inches even though I am using floatant. This obviously prevents me from seeing the fly due to it sinking a few inches under the water. Any tips or tricks on how to avoid this would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again for all your hard work and for helping me get into this amazing sport." Well, Jordan, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. First off, your first part of your question about using 2 flies so that you can see the small fly. Absolutely. I do that all the time. I'm still relatively young and I have a hard time seeing those smaller flies. So what I'll do is I'll tie on like a size 16 or sometimes a size 18 parachute version because I can see those a little bit better of the bug that I'm trying to mimic. So if I'm out and it's a blue-winged olive hatch, for example, then I'll have a size 16 parachute blue-winged olive on, and then I'll put about 18 inches of tippet off to the bend of that hook with a clinch knot, and then I will put my smaller fly, like my 18 or my 20 cripple or emerger, and I'll tie that on the end. And then that parachute becomes almost an indicator. You can find that, and then you can look and usually find your small fly behind it. Or if you can't find your small fly, you can still look at that parachute, and if it moves or if it goes under, then yes, set the hook because a fish just ate the small fly on the other end of it. I don't use indicators for dry fly work. It messes with the drift. That big bobber can put fish down. A pinch-on foam indicator might work, but I've never had success with those staying on my line. You're just going to get a better drift and a better presentation if you don't use them, so I would definitely shy away from using them and then just go with that bigger dry fly to act as your indicator instead. Now to your second question about mending. It sounds like your mends are either too aggressive or too late. So when you're mending, you are just picking up and moving your fly line to a spot where it won't cause drag on your flies or your bobber. It's a very simple process. It is not another cast. A lot of beginners, a lot of intermediate anglers even treat the mend as if it's another cast, as if you're actually casting that line, and you're not. You're just picking the line up. You use your rod to do it. You pick the line up and move it, and it's a very fluid motion. There shouldn't be stops or jerks to it. It's a very fluid movement of the rod and your arm. And when you think of it like another cast, you end up moving the fly line a lot more than they need to, and moving that fly line is going to move your flies or your bobber, and that might cause your leader to get pulled under the water, which is then going to sink your fly. So be mindful of how aggressive your mends are. And then if you're mending too late, the other thing that it could be is what happens is your fly line's already created this big belly in it that's causing drag. You see the drag, you think, oh, I've got to mend. And if you're in quicker water, then the flies can sink because of that big belly that's causing drag. So when you go to mend, you're going to pull your fly underwater because it's going to follow your fly line. The fly line's already been pushed underwater. You go to mend, and it's just going to pull everything under the water. So usually you want to make a mend immediately after your cast. So you drop the cast, you throw a mend, and that's going to get you a nice good drift for a long time. You might need to throw more mends, just depending on the length of the drift and how you're fishing it. But you do want to throw that first mend right after the flies hit the water. Another issue too is that if you get a lot of junk on your fly, like dirt or fish slime or moss or whatever, then it can cause that dry fly to sink as well. So cleaning off your flies might be necessary at that point too. We've also got an in-depth video on mending that I'll link in the show notes. I think it really helps explain mending better than it does listening to it on a podcast. So hopefully that's helpful. And I appreciate you taking the time to write in, Jordan. Thank you. Zach from Oregon has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey guys, I have a question about after you catch a fish on a dry fly. My dry fly seems to just go underwater and doesn't float anymore. No matter how many times I false cast to dry it off or add the float powder, it just seems to sink. Do I need to switch the fly out every time I catch one? Thanks. Love the show." Hey, Zach, good question. So what I do is I use the liquid floatant first. Before I make any casts or do anything, I'll dress my dry flies with a liquid floatant, and I use the Loon Aquel. It's the stuff that we sell here at VFC. Everybody on the team uses it. It's great floatant, relatively affordable. And then once that starts to wear off and I see my dry fly starting to sink a little bit, then I will bring it in and I will use the Loon Top Ride. It's this shake to dry the fly off. That system works really well for me because it just keeps my flies floating the longest. I've gone through a few different products, and that's really what I've come back to using is the liquid floatant initially, and then I'll use the shake once it starts to sink. Another tip as well is make sure you grease up the first 2 feet of your leader or tippet above your dry fly, because that'll help keep that up as well so that it won't sink. But after you catch a fish on your dry flies, make sure you blow them off, just hold them right by your mouth, blow them off. If you've got a little cotton patch or something on your vest, or just dry it off in your sleeve, clean it off, dry it off, and then shake it a little bit before you add any powder floatant to it. That'll help absorb that powder floatant better. And then you can reapply the liquid floatant too. I've got a buddy who doesn't use any of the powder stuff. He just reapplies the liquid floatant when it quits working, and he catches tons. He catches way more fish than I do. So there might be something to what he's doing, but it's relatively simple. Just use that system and you should be good to go. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it. Doug from Wisconsin has our next question, writes in and says, "Love the podcast and instructional videos. How do you properly partner your leader / tippet size with the flies you are throwing? Do you need to swap out your leader and tippet as you change your fly? P.S. I'm also a veteran teacher." Doug, well, I'm no veteran. I washed out after 3 years. I couldn't hack it anymore. Oh, so the rule of thumb is that you're going to take your fly size and divide it by 3, and that tells you what tippet or leader size to use. So if you've got a size 14 fly, divide that by 4, it's about 4, so you'd use 4x tippet. A size 16 divided by 3 is about 5, so you'd want 5x leader or tippet in that instance. But to be completely honest, I really don't get all that concerned about it. It's just, until I get down to a size 18, I use 4x for everything. From like my size 10s all the way down to my 16s, I use that for everything. I don't have any problems. I don't really worry about it until I start getting into the smaller flies. Now, you don't need to change out your entire leader just because you're changing your fly. That's why we have tippet. It's so that you can add or subtract tippet from your leader to appropriately size it to your flies. But again, you can just go with a 4x leader and be good for flies from about 10 to 16, like I mentioned. But this is also why I rarely have a 5x leader. I usually have a 3 or a 4x leader, because I can tie any length of tippet onto the end of that I want, but then I can cut it off just the leader, and I've got a thick enough leader that I can throw streamers or big dry flies or big nymphs with. So it's a lot more versatile if you go with a 3 or a 4x leader instead of a 5x right out of the gate. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question. I appreciate you sending it in. Stetson from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, When tying a dry dropper, should it consist of the same fly? Example would be an adult caddis with a caddis larva. I'm just wondering if I could tie two different types of flies or if it's smarter to do that to see what the fish are wanting. Well, Stetson, no, there is no rule that you need to have the same flies for your dry and your dropper, like a caddis dry and a caddis larva for the dropper. Because remember, there are very few, almost no hard and fast rules in fly fishing. Okay, so it's important to not get stuck into that process of, oh, well, I've got to do it this way or it won't work, because that's just not true. Okay, there's a ton of different ways to catch fish with a fly rod. Okay, you've got to figure out and experiment with what works for you. Most often, when I've got my dry dropper rig set up, I've got a hopper or a caddis on top, maybe a mayfly sometimes, and then I follow that with a mayfly nymph or a midge or a stonefly nymph as my dropper. I rarely match the two. In fact, the only time I really match them is when I'm fishing a hatch. So I'll have an adult caddis up top and my caddis emerger on the bottom, or a blue wing on top and a small pheasant tail nymph on the bottom. It's also really good to use two different species to prospect if you don't know what the fish are eating. If you get to the river and you see there's some caddis coming off, but there's also some mayflies, or maybe you see stoneflies too, and you don't know which one the fish are keyed in on, then you can use the dry dropper setup to figure out, okay, they're eating caddis because they're all eating the Frenchie or the hare's ear, okay? Or they're eating midges because they're eating the zebra midge. It can really help clarify things for you as well. And then you can switch to match that. If they are eating one thing in particular, let's say they're eating your stonefly nymph. Let's say you've got a dry dropper. And you've got a hopper, a stonefly nymph, and a zebra midge, and they ignore the midge. Well, at that point, you cut the midge off, you can put a stonefly on top, and boom, you're in business. So it's a great way to prospect, figure out exactly what the fish are going to eat. Thanks for the question, Stetson. I appreciate it. And with that, folks, we're going to jump into the live real life moment, so don't go anywhere. Every week, we end the show by sharing stories from the VFC audience of folks out there on the water who are living real life. We love to hear and see all the adventures y'all are having. So if you've got a live real life moment that you would like to share, there's a link to send those in the show notes. Keep them coming. We've had some great ones lately, guys. And this week's live real life moment is from Kyle. Writes in and says, backpacked a trail in Yellowstone National Park for our anniversary. Packed the essentials in an ultralight fanny pack with a 4-piece, 6-foot 3-weight rod and mini reel. Got everything down to about 2.5 pounds. I fished sections of the Yellowstone River and Hell Roaring River in the backcountry by our camp. I didn't expect to catch anything, just to have fun after a long day of backpacking. I only saw 1 to 2 risers, so I threw on a small hopper dropper setup and was instantly grinning ear to ear. They were taking both flies like they had never eaten in their lives. We'll never forget the experience, gorgeous landscape, and beautiful native fish. Kyle, that's awesome. That is one trip. I should have added that to my bucket list. I want to get into the Yellowstone backcountry and experience that. And that sounds like a fantastic anniversary trip, too. Props to planning that. Backpacking in Yellowstone for the anniversary. I love it. So thank you for sending that in. I appreciate it. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up this week's show. Thank you so much for being here and listening to the whole show. That helps us out more than you know. And if you want to help us out even more, you can subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. You can rate it because the more subscriptions we get, the more ratings we get, the more folks we can reach and help live real life. And if you've got questions or live real life moments, send those in as well. There's links to do that in the show notes. And if you need any more help with fly fishing at all, we've got tons of other content. You can click on all the links that you see. And until next week, everybody, get out in the water, have some fun, and live real life.